Hey everyone, Pastor George here today with our Bible study recap. And today we moved into the fourth chapter of the first letter of Peter. And this is where we start getting to what I know to be like what I remember most about the letters of Peter, which is when he starts talking about suffering. So First Peter 4 is kind of all about that. But what it is it starts to draw a disconnect between the way that Christians are supposed to carry ourselves in the world versus, the normal way that the world kind of carries itself, right? So Peter points out here that we are supposed to live to glorify God, right? That's at the very end in verse 11 itself. That's where he kind of says the quiet part out loud if you want to use that type of language. But you'll notice what in this he points out a lot of things that we shouldn't do or shouldn't take part in, right? So things like orgies or drunkenness and stuff like that. And what he's doing here is he's contrasting the life of the Christians before they converted, because remember, most of these people are Gentiles before they converted, into what they are now, right? So he's saying that the Christians do not carry ourselves like this, right? We have to be sober minded. We have to be full of good judgment. So we can't be just living these party animal type of lifestyles that's normal in the society, right? Kind of living for pleasure and not for anything greater than that. So Peter is really gunning at the separation and the difference between these two things, right? That's why he's making a big deal out of it. So Peter here is trying to get us to see that once we do that, it leads to other problems, and that's why he starts off by talking about suffering in the flesh. And in verse 2, when he says, if you've suffered in the flesh, then you cease to sin. That might be a little bit of a weird thing to say, but what he's getting at here is he's having this idea of like once you've experienced suffering, which is something we all do, but especially within the light of Christ, you understand that suffering has purpose and has meaning outside of just happening, right? And so the purpose of suffering is to make us more like Christ, right? So this can happen once we detach ourselves from society, right? Jesus warns us about this, that we are going to face persecution and things like that. But it is certainly going to happen as we begin to deny ourselves, right? So that's his thing, and you're going to see next week how he gets more into that. But we talked about a little bit of what that meant, and in our own personal lives, and so it'd probably be worth thinking about in your own, like what suffering you have been through, where you can find purpose and meaning in that suffering, and how that actually can affect the way that we carry ourselves, especially because we know that our suffering through Christ has purpose. Lastly, we talked about how the Christian community is marked as different because of the care for one another and the temperance that we are supposed to carry ourselves with, right? Depending on what your translation is, you can see this manifested in different ways, but ultimately the reason that we carry ourselves this way is for God's glory and not our own. So that's what we talked about this morning, right? It was just 11 verses, but there's a lot in there that is applicable to our lives, right? Especially if we're willing to kind of get in there and realize that, suffering is a part of what we are going to be experiencing in this life. And so how do we take something that is so difficult and turn it to our good? Well, Peter's going to give us a little bit more about that next week, but this is just to get our noggins jogging. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your week. I will see you next week for our next Bible study recap, and tomorrow for the mailbag. Peace out.